Hello, everyone, and welcome to another PropModa webinar. I am Franco, and as always, I will be your host. Thank you all so much for joining. This looks like it will be the last webinar of the year for us, so I'm excited. I obviously have some holiday decorations up. Hopefully, all of you guys are enjoying your holiday season so far. Excited about today's webinar. I think there's a lot going on when it comes to kind of what we'll call non-traditional data around real estate. And so, we have kind of pegged some of the data behind consumer behavior as something that is, really impactful. Obviously, for retail real estate, that's it's been really important for a long time. But I think also other asset classes are starting to understand the power of of maybe kind of non-traditional data, especially as it can be applied to on the very micro level now, right? I think back in the day it was a lot more of business districts, zip codes, all of that, and now I mean it'll let you zoom into every property and a lot of really powerful stuff that we'll get into today. So thank you all again for joining. And without further ado, I will introduce our experts here. We have Kate Zovad. She's VP of Product and Industry Marketing at Near, a location data intelligence platform. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Franco.
Hope I said that name right?
You
Zovad?
did. I'm just feeling pressure to make sure you go out with a bang if this is your last webinar of 2023.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have confetti or something fall at the end of this one to celebrate. Also, I have back on the program Josh Pankman. He's Director of Real Estate AI and Innovation at a small liberal arts school called Columbia University. Hi, Josh.
Go. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you guys for joining. I think obviously the people that are watching this now are probably experts in their own regard. I think I saw a lot of real estate people, a lot of kind of corporate real estate people as well. So I want to invite all of you to join in on this. This is live, and instead of saving time at the end for questions, if you guys have any comments or questions, you can go ahead and throw them into the chat here. I will be monitoring them, and if they are, if they're pertinent, I'm happy to address them. So let's start first, just kind of talking a little bit about this term that I used earlier, which is like traditional real estate data, right? So let's kind of set this, and I think most of us have an idea of it, but it is expanded a little bit too, right? So I think obviously it was originally kind of public record type data, right? But as technology has grown, I think there's a lot more out there. So, Kate, when you think about kind of traditional real estate data, what comes to mind? What are some of the data sources that you think, we should really peg this to?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's always been a fairly data-rich industry. So I think, it sort of in buckets, you have your transactional sort of data, the core logics, commercial information exchange, property, sales history, tax records, whether that's public or first party, the sort of backwards looking data about the site itself. And then companies usually do a pretty good job of layering on publicly available market data on top of that. So like demographics, census data, environmental reports, maybe like regional economic data, and cost data, construction costs, vendors, the architects, that sort of thing. And then there have been, I think sort of the more innovative companies do things like ground intercept surveys and do like footfall counting with clickers. And that's the kind of data that I think we're really ripe to replace, both at scale and digitally, with consumer behavior data. And then, I'm hearing about a lot of just really sources that you might not even consider when you're evaluating a property or a site, such as like social media and web data, behavioral data coming from people's digital footprints. Then of course you have like IoT and all that. But Josh was telling us earlier before the call a little bit about some work he's doing, I think looking at Yelp data to understand consumer behavior. So it's a very broad category and very nascent.
Yeah, I we'll get into that a little bit, some of what Josh is working on, but I think you kind of hit when I think about it, I think you hit it's like backwards looking generally, right? Historical data, because there are kind of new sources of what I would call traditional data. I think Comstack for on the office side, VTS, obviously provides a lot of really great kind of historical data. But in my mind, that's still kind of traditional, right? Because it's about the building itself, it's backwards looking, right? And so these new types are obviously looking, it's only so good to look backwards, right? At some point, you have to have that predictive ability. And so I've seen a lot more people using, mobile location data, internet kind of data, all of that to look a little bit for moving companies, right? Have really great resources for demographic data. So Josh, why don't you kind of tell us your thoughts about these, the kind of the growing universe of real estate data and maybe some of the things that you're looking at as far as helping make better real estate decisions.
We're actually asking all those same questions. There's something we found when we start building these projects, and it's mostly machine learning and deep learning applications, which are forms of AI. We start looking at how that problem has been addressed in the past. How do we value real estate, for example, any kind of real estate? How do you value that? And we go back and we look at other approaches that people have taken, and we try to build those models. One of the things that we find, though, is that in much of the academic literature, or even the books that are written on real estate valuation, they're written using data that was available 5 or 10 years ago, modeling approaches that were available 5 to 10 years ago. And we have much more data today. We have many more tools today. We have computational power that we didn't have back then. So many of these things don't apply. So what we're having to do is go back and reinvent the wheel in a way and say, how do we look at this process? How do we understand the process? And 40 to 50% of our work on any project is understanding the process and the problem. What are the inputs? What are the features that affect the outcomes? How do people shop? How is a building valued? And for example, one of the things we found just with valuation is that it's not just the building that determines value. And even if that building has the same income, that income stays stable. If it's in a neighborhood that's growing faster relative to other neighborhoods in that city, then the value is going to increase faster than it does in other neighborhoods. That has nothing to do with the building itself. It has to do with the location, what's going on around it. Our business is changing, our demographics changing. Is it becoming more gentrified? Is it a part of the city that is benefiting from something else that's going on? And so there are many layers, but you do have to take into account how that building is operating, how it's functioning, and the potential that it has. But it's not just the building itself. And many times the building and even the lease rates that then affect the building value are more affected by what's happening in the area than what's happening in that building itself. What we find is ourselves going down a rabbit hole of data and getting more and more detailed as to how we make sense of these things. One of the things that I've learned, I was in real estate for a long time before I came over to the technical side, but one of the things that I've learned is that you have to get very, very detailed on how you build these models. All of these models they're math. It's not magic. It's not, I'm just going to throw some data and magical AI man is going to give me whatever information I have. You have to build these models. Humans build these models, and they build those models based on a representation of what's going on in the world, or how that problem is addressed in the world, how it plays out in the real world. And many times that problem is much more nuanced and much more detailed than what people imagine it to be. So it's an exploration of what those features are, what those factors are, what those inputs are. And then we step back and we say, well, how do we get that data? How do we make sense of that? How do we quantitatively make sense of that? Because a computer needs data, it needs inputs, it needs quantitative information. Even if it's qualitative, the computer will transfer that into something that is quantitative so that it can measure, do some statistical analysis or some kind of mathematical analysis to tell you what that pattern is. How do we understand those features? How do we get data that represents those features? And then how do we create quantitative models that will allow us to make sense of how those features affect the overall outcome that we're looking for?
Yeah, and the data is only so useful, right? Yeah, it's like the models that it goes into, how those models are built, and I think that's been a bit of a tricky spot for a lot of the real estate industry because most real estate operators don't have the technical side, especially something as new as fast moving like machine learning, AI. So keeping up with that and maybe also just kind of understanding the the limits of it and what what it can actually do is a huge part of that. So let's get a little bit into the kind of the use cases for these new types of forward-looking data. Yeah, I think obviously there's a bit of kind of trend spotting, like we talked about. This is, since it is forward-looking, I think that's what the real estate industry is really trying to use them for, is to say, okay, I can maybe peg right now how this, let's just call it a mall, is doing, right? But maybe the place is changing. Maybe the types of stores in the mall are changing, and that might kind of amplify what's going on now. So, Kate, what have you seen working with clients about kind of the practical use cases for kind of trend spotting of this data?
Yeah, and I might show you just a slide to kind of show you what this particular data looks like. But just to kind of dovetail on what you and Josh were saying, not only is there just myriad and variegated new data available, and not only do you have to have really extensive sort of math skills and kind of an understanding of how models work, there's also a third component, which is this whole sort of data engineering side, and sort of making sure that your infrastructure and the way that you build metadata and the way you build security and access and data lakes to kind of join very disparate data types is all in place as well. So there's a lot of components. The data is kind of really just the raw ingredient, but how you put it to work requires a lot.
Very much emphasize that is 80% of the work that you do in any of these problems.
100%. So, but to get to your question about use cases, the real estate industry has there's so much heterogeneity in the kinds of users. So I think it is really important, if you're starting a project like this, to ask yourself what is going to serve, the particular user, whether that is a municipality or an entitlement, architects, builders, engineers, brokers, tenants, investors. They all have different objectives literally in their day-to-day jobs. So I think kind of starting with where am I going to be able to move the needle most is an important question. And then on top of the heterogeneity of the value chain itself, you have the fact that this is a super dynamic industry. So an investor's objectives one year may be completely different when interest rates rise. So first we always kind of advise start with asking the question. Having said that, I think what we see in terms of the most widely adopted use cases in commercial real estate kind of fall loosely into a few buckets. Investment evaluation is really probably the biggest one. So exactly as Josh said, it's becoming to be not so much about evaluating a property and looking back at like a property's lease history. It's much more about the market and the area, and is it growing, and is it dynamic, is it exposed to trends like we're seeing, or like we saw with the work from home stuff going on with COVID. So understanding popularity, identifying shifts. The second one we see a lot is new tenant acquisition. So identifying and marketing to the right mix of potential tenants by understanding, really what real estate is matching a use case and a person to a location. So understanding what kinds of literally consumers and peoples by demographic a place is most likely to attract, where they live, where they work, whether you're situated on a commuting corridor or not. And seeing a lot of our customers use us to evaluate properties by proxy. So they'll take a very similar market or a very similar tenant or retail type and look at similar performing properties in the area and kind of do a comparison if you don't have history with that particular building to look at it on its own. And then finally, the third use case that we see a lot is using this data as a marketing and sales tool to distinguish your property for sale. So making sure that you are telling a story about a property that goes into really more detail and also mitigates risk better than maybe alternative investments that somebody might be evaluating. And I think, if you're a large real estate services provider, that's a real value add that you can add on top of services to your clients is getting really nuanced and really detailed about predicting the future performance of a property. So I thought maybe I would just kind of show you what this looks like. Just take 1 second to digress for a minute, if I know how to do this. Are you seeing my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So real estate really runs the gamut. I mean, I think you have historically, companies that have been a little bit more laggards in terms of their adoption of technology, you can't in any way negate the importance of local market understanding. And I think for a really long time, using sort of lore and gut and instinct and experience has been effective enough in real estate. And I think we're seeing that change a little bit. So these are some of the methods that our clients actually still use today to evaluate, in this instance, a trade area. And there are problems with this. So if you use a standard rule of thumb, like a 1 mile radius, this is probably very obvious, but if you go into a really dense urban setting, you're going to be thinking that you have potential cannibalization when you really don't at all. Same applies for competitors who might be co-located there. I mentioned companies still use a lot of ground truth surveys. That's good, but they tend to be very self-selecting. There tends to be real selection bias in who participates. And again, as you said, Franco, it's immediately backwards looking, this kind of data. And then you have the kind of really standard 1, 3, 5 mile trade areas. The problem with that is it doesn't take into account like geographical features, like is someone going to cross a river to go to your location? So this is showing, actual trade areas drawn from a true understanding of the home and work locations of actual visitors over time to those sites, to kind of show you the comparison between what the real trade area is with what the assumed trade area is. And I want to point out that a small trade area in a place like Manhattan is not a bad thing at all. So it's not like wide trade area good, small trade area bad. It's really about what your business can support. So this is kind of an example of what the alternative looks like. So we use PIN data to kind of show heat maps in shopping centers and to show pathing and to show sort of where people cross visit. When they go to a grocery store, do they go to the bank on the way home? What areas within a mall are most densely visited? Insights by day part is really important. So, just to say this is a busy area doesn't suffice anymore. It might be very busy during lunch or commuting hours, but it's not maybe busy during the evening. So understanding kind of how people move about just even within the course of a day is important. And then, as I said, using sort of a hex grid to understand trade area becomes really important when you're looking specifically at competitor performance in an area. So this shows the denser the hexagon, that means that location contributes more people to the store that we're saying. So, and you'll find that most areas contribute people to various franchises. And that's not bad at all. It's just important to really understand the movement patterns of people in the area that you're evaluating. So I thought it'd be important just to kind of show visually the kind of data that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to, oh, go on. You want to show that one too? I'd love to focus in a little bit on the tenant acquisition piece, because I think that it kind of crosses over asset class. Like obviously retail, that's huge, but I think increasingly for office too, right? Like understanding the risk of a tenant has everything to do with, even the valuation, right? And so, Josh, I know you've worked a lot on kind of valuations and modeling risk. It's, obviously a tricky proposition, but what do you see as some of the maybe more sophisticated ways that people are looking at tenants to understand that the true risk of whether or not they're going to be there for the entire lease?
It's a very difficult thing to do because there are a lot of what I call fuzzy inputs to that process. You have to not only predict what's going to happen in an industry, you have to predict what's going to happen in a market, and you have to be able to understand parts of tenants. I have a colleague at NYU, Tim Savage, who says real estate data is very broad, but it's not deep. So we have a little bit of information on every property that's out there, but we only have a little bit of information on every property compared to the amount of information that is actually produced or that would be relevant to understanding how that building runs. The same thing when we're looking at tenant acquisition. You have to look at things like, who do you think is going to be there over the long term? Who do you think is, and not just over the term of the lease, but who is most likely to renew that lease at the end? Because somebody that's there for 20 or 30 years is probably going to, or a tenant that stays in this space for 20 or 30 years is going to have less loss of lease because that tenant left after 5 or 10 years, less tenant improvements. Those are all costs that go into that process. So somebody that has longevity and staying power is important. But also for retail, and this is where we start going down that rabbit hole and where things start to diverge pretty significantly is for retail. If you're an owner of a shopping center, let's say you want to get tenants that is the highest and best use for that specific center, not just somebody to pay rent, but who is going to benefit most from that location and that center at that time. Because the more valuable that space is to that retailer, the more valuable that space is to me as the owner of that property, and the more value that property is going to be. For office, it's very different. Is who do we think is going to maintain space over a long period of time? Who are we going to look at, or how are we going to evaluate the credit rating of that tenant? One of the things we did when I was at Deutsche trading CMBS is we would, for public tenants that had listings on the stock exchange, we would look at their bond ratings, and we would compare their bond ratings to a 10-year treasury, and we say, what's the yield there? If the yield is pretty close, pretty tight, then the market is viewing them as a relatively stable company, and we can view that tenant as relatively stable. But then we had to take it a step further and say, well, just because they're a stable company doesn't mean anything. Does that lease have a corporate guarantee on it? If it does, then we feel more comfortable. If it doesn't, then you introduce a whole nother level of risk, because maybe they don't want to stay in that space long term. Maybe they're going to pay their out clause or whatever it is. If you're dealing with a tenant that is not publicly traded, then you have no information. You don't have their credit rating. You really know nothing about them. You have to know the industry. You have to know that player's strength and competitiveness within the industry, and you have to put some kind of quantitative value on the credit rating of that tenant. That's what a buyer does. That's what a lender is going to do. That's how that investment evaluation process works. But that's fuzzy. How do you do that? How do you put a specific number on that process? And one of the things Kate was talking about where things change, we call that non-stationarity. You can't build a model that's going to value a property the same way under every single market condition over a 10-year period. Sometimes the market is going up, sometimes the market is going down. Those are different models because there are different features that are more important at different times. So it's getting to that nuanced level of how do I look at an office building? How do I look at a suburban office building versus a midtown office building? Taking into account the market. One of the things I remember we looked at a lot was we had Manhattan in New York, and there was like a 94% occupancy rate for office. Meaning if a tenant left the building, so let's say we're looking at a building and we see a tenant that's expiring in 2 years, but the office market in Manhattan at that time was, let's say, 94% occupancy for a Class A space. There's not many places for that tenant to move to if they wanted to move. And if they did leave that space, then there's not much space for other businesses to move into. So it's likely that that space is going to be released relatively quickly. And the market was healthy at that time. So there wasn't much risk associated with that particular lease. But then we looked at places like, at the time, I think it was Dallas, Texas had a 77% occupancy rate for real estate. So you take that same building with a lease that expires in 2 years, your risk is much higher in a place that has a lower occupancy rate and less absorption than in a market that has a higher occupancy rate with high net absorption. Those are all inputs into that process. And that's where you go down this into so many fingers of detail that actually matter to that analysis process. And to be able to analyze these things, you actually have to have information. You have to have data. You have to have quantifiable data that you can put into that model to give you a better predictive capability. And that's a really difficult thing to do in real estate. And in fact, I think in many applications, it's impossible. And you and I have talked about this, where there are a lot of companies out there, a lot of startups that are trying to do things that are not technically possible given the amount of data that we have and the modeling techniques we have access to. But understanding that process, what you can do versus what you can't do. If you're trying to do something that's not technically possible, you're going to waste your time and your money, and you're not going to get the kind of output you're looking for, the outcome you're looking for. On the other hand, maybe there are certain parts of that process that you can automate and you can get better information, and then you have a human come in with expertise that can bring in their experience, and you can consolidate, you can combine those two pieces of information so the human makes better decisions based on the information and the analytics that you have from the parts of the process that can be analyzed. But you get that by understanding that entire process much better than we've had to in the past, because humans haven't had to quantify many of these decisions. You use your experience and your intuition, as Kate said, use your gut instinct to say, I think it's this, or I have a feeling that's that. Whoever's gut instinct was better was most successful. But to analyze these things, to quantify them, to get into that kind of detailed analytics, they have to be quantified. And we're having a very difficult time quantifying many of those aspects that are relevant to the decision-making process now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're totally right about the rabbit hole, right? Is that you can keep going down and analyzing, like the broad category might be strong. I'm thinking of like, Sears, the Rite Aid recently, WeWork, right? Like the broad category might be strong, but the actual operator itself might have some structural issues or be having problems, right? And so to be able to say, okay, what's the category? What's the operator? Do you think that we'll be able to maybe, obviously the AI is not going to make the decision for us, but do you think that we'll get to a point where some of that kind of, that research can be done at scale, right? It can be done faster and easier where you can analyze, hundreds or thousands of prospective tenants in kind of that deep way. Josh, what do you think? Do you think that that's like a fixable problem?
I don't think we have the capability to do it, to fully automate that process. But again, we can get to places where we take parts of that process, certain inputs, certain
apart.
things that are relevant, and we have then we have a better ability to make a decision. One of the things we did at Deutsche is we couldn't completely automate the valuation of properties. But what we did was we automated the process of combining data from different sources that were relevant to our decision-making process. And then we built some more simplistic rules. Do I have a major tenant that's expiring before the bond expires or before the loan comes due? Is there a volatility in occupancy of this property that's above a certain threshold that we're comfortable with? Is the DSCR, the debt service coverage, lower than we would like it to be? And we flag those things. And if none of those risk factors were present, then it allowed us to spend much less time looking at that property. If some of those risk factors were present, then that told us that we needed to spend more time. So what happens if we had 100 properties in the portfolio and an issue, I might be able to get rid of 85 or 90 of them because they don't have the kind of risk factors that would concern us. And then we spend time on 10 or 15 of them. We can go much deeper on that analysis. We can get much better. We can ask more insightful questions. We have the time to do that. So it's a combination of what can we automate, what can we analyze, and then where does a human need to step in? So for a lease evaluation or tenant evaluation process, you have to go through that same modeling approach and say, what is important? Right? What is conceptually important? Theoretically, how would we do this in an ideal way? And then we say, well, what can we quantify? What can we automate? We build those tools, and then humans come in and supplement the rest with expertise and information that may be difficult to quantify.
That jives with some research that we did. We did a consumer behavior data study this year. We interviewed people leaders from a lot of industries. I think 83 were from commercial real estate. And we sort of made some assumptions about what they were finding most challenging about working with this kind of data. But it was exactly, Josh, what you said about your work at Deutsche, that we thought really their challenges would be about driving adoption, driving use of the data down and sort of more democratically across the organization. And it wasn't. Their number one challenge is just figuring out how to combine different data sources, because there's not one of these vendors or sources that answers these questions. They have to have a lot of different inputs applied to them, and those are not all structured the same way, and they're not all easily accessible by the same analytic environments and analytic tools. So we're still really at square one.
I got some interesting questions coming in here. Thanks, everybody. One is this kind of, obviously it's hard, but do you have some specific examples of products that produce valuable insights or forecasts that kind of help with that gut feel, right? I've heard a lot of real estate people still say like, well, it's a gut feel kind of a thing, but now that we have more data to maybe validate a gut feel, what are some of those? Obviously, there's platforms like Near, right, which have this kind of consumer mobile behavior. Maybe what else do you see, Kate, as far as kind of ways to incorporate other data sets, or what other data sets kind of can be brought into this location analysis that are really helpful?
No, that's a great question. I'd love to get Josh's perspective too. But I think One thing is maybe if you're able to get first party data from tenants or, point of sale data, data that kind of shows beyond just footfall, the relative success of a property. So I think partnering and sort of creating your own ecosystem of various stakeholders and getting them to share their first party data versus, necessarily sourcing a lot of different third party data is probably a decent starting place.
Josh, what about, like using the property data? Like a lot of these property companies already have pretty good insights based on what they've seen, what works and what doesn't. How maybe can real estate operators think about bringing in these new types of data and also mixing it with, some of those kind of proprietary insights that they already have?
I'm not surprised that the questions came from Taylor and Magnus. So, pretty typical, but good questions. Taylor's question is, I get this all the time, and I struggle with this as well. I do. One of the things that makes it hard for me to answer that is we don't deal with a lot of what I call operational, maybe incremental or automation functions. So the things that we work on at Columbia and that I've worked on in my career are more what I would call strategic. So how do we understand market cycles, market timing, how different markets react in under different economic scenarios? And when we do that, we build up, we call them systems. It's like a tree of information where we build up all of this data that's relevant and figure out the functions and the relationships. There's not much out there that I've come across or that I've heard about from many companies that combine those things in a holistic way and in a meaningful way that companies are able to plug in. And one of the complaints we hear from the larger companies, the more complex and sophisticated companies we're working with, is that there are a lot of narrow pieces, something that that deals with a very specific function, rather than something that produces an insight, as Taylor's asking about. Because most of those things, those insights, come from a combination of a lot of this data. The problem, the question that you asked, Franco, is that real estate is so fractured and so heterogeneous that the proprietary information that one owner has is not sufficient to make sense of all of that heterogeneity in the market. Even larger companies, Blackstone, Brookfield, they own a ton of real estate, but it's a very small portion of the real estate that exists. And the problem we have with that is that there's geographic decay. So if I have one property, then the information about properties 10 or 20 miles away don't really apply. I can't really use that. They're not all that valuable because they're different markets, different dynamics. I can't use things that a property next door that sold 10 years ago because there's temporal decay there. So even when you have a lot of information relative to others, you have very little information relative to the entirety of the information that actually exists in that market, whether it's captured or not. And it makes it much more difficult. One of the problems with machine learning, and Kate alluded to this earlier, is the data engineering side, is making sense of it. There's something called the curse of dimensionality, where when you have a problem that has a lot of features, a lot of relevant inputs, then you need a lot of observations in order to find the patterns in those inputs. We don't have that in real estate. We do have a lot of dimensions. We have a lot of features about a property that affect its valuation, but we have a very small number of properties that we can use for that analysis. And it gives us a lot of variance and makes it more difficult. So to Taylor's question, I think I don't know of anything that exists that does that effectively in the kinds of applications that we're building. Maybe in things that are more relevant to the operations inside of a building or inside of a company. There might be things out there. I'm not aware of them. It's just not what we deal with. But the value is going to come in building things that are more holistic, taking an entire function and building out that functionality. That functionality might be one of 50 or 100 pieces of information that company uses. But if you break that down, there are probably 100 more functions within that one function that you can build out and plug in. Because real estate is so complex, it is so heterogeneous, the questions that you have to ask are so specific that building a model or having some data is usually just not sufficient for getting there. I think that's what we've seen in the market. you haven't seen an Aladdin or the kinds of things that have been built by the hedge funds that are dealing with equities or the more standardized assets like bonds, options, equities. You have a lot of information. You have very detailed information. We don't have that in real estate, so it's been very difficult for real estate to replicate that kind of functionality and that kind of success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because the amount of data that you have on a property is limited, but now with the internet, I mean, he makes a point about the kind of survival rates, on Yelp. Like there is quite a bit of let's call it consumer behavior data around maybe not property specific, but around certain retailers, around certain areas of town, right? So do you think there is something to be gained from kind of, obviously there's lots of data that you can buy, but maybe building kind of scraping tools to look at the publicly available data on the internet?
Well, and I'd say, before even getting to scraping, you raise a good point. One thing that we've seen our customers really evolve to is trying to get a lot more sophisticated in how they select a proxy property, because as Josh said, it's not just going to be, I can go around the corner and find a similarly sized building with a similar footprint around the block. So we have customers like getting really granular about, I want to identify this exact kind of retailer who's this size, who does this much turnover every year, and maybe, and they're in this DMA, and it might be across the country, or they're in this kind of neighborhood that has this kind of demographic. But the proxy may not be in Dallas. The proxy may actually be that there's a super similar neighborhood in Cleveland that also has a spaghetti factory or whatever. So sort of like, again, and this requires some data science sophistication, but getting a little creative in your definitions and sort of what a proxy looks like, and what you consider dwell time and the definition of a visit and all of these things, to try to sort of standardize them so that you can draw upon a broader breadth of data that's available to you, but you may not own, is an approach that we're seeing.
Yeah, and especially when we talk about forward looking, right? I think that's a great point, is that the next big thing might be the next state over and you haven't heard of it yet, right? The next Chick-fil-A or some giant
like Medtail, experiential retail, like people, like we're seeing a lot of malls totally change their anchor strategy, and they're doing that to expand their trade area, and they're doing that by sort of mimicking what's happening in places that are maybe even in different countries.
Right. Like your neighborhood might be unique in your town, but it might be pretty similar, to another kind
Hopefully, yeah, because you're right. It's a dearth of really similar available data out there. So hopefully you can find something that'll serve as a proxy.
Yeah, we have a question here specifically for you, Kate, from Magnus. So talk to us about where you get your data on the 1.6 billion unique user IDs. That's a pretty
Absolutely
number.
So we source data from hundreds of thousands of apps that are on your mobile phone. So you probably have lots of apps on your phone. We're obviously very scrupulous about making sure that location sharing is totally opt-in and turned on, but that's how we have such a huge breadth of data, aggregating lots and lots and lots of different app providers.
And this I think is important because it gives you not only context about where the person was, right, and how they moved about, but also about them, right? Those apps are collecting data that can be cross-referenced with some of this location stuff as well, correct?
Yep, and we also, as I said, cross-reference it with Experian type data, demographic type data, geosocial, like social media behavior. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And that does vary, like what the app is able to legally like collect and share about their customer is specific, and we have to be very careful about sort of not overstepping on that. But yes, we do. The data about just where people go isn't as valuable as understanding who those people are and how where they go is kind of a proxy for what the, who they are, what they spend, what their income is, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, as silly as kind of drawing a 1 or 5 mile circle around a property to identify comps or trade areas or any of these things is, I also think that we will look back and see how silly it is to use kind of general demographic data, right? Like
Mhm,
an
mhm.
18 to 26-year-old in Wyoming is not going to have the same, consumer behavior as one in New York City, right? Like,
Yeah, or the example I use, or even just, I mean, a lot of people go, well, I have, pretty good digital footprint data. My son's in college. He spends a lot of time looking at cars on websites, but haven't seen him in a Porsche dealership.
yeah,
Probably not a candidate to buy.
yeah,
You
that's
really
true.
want to marry the online and offline behavior. That's kind of the holy grail, is to get a real 360 view of how people spend their time, because increasingly they're spending their time online. But they also are making choices with literally where they place their feet.
Great point. I think some of what I have heard is that, there's so much data available. It's sometimes hard, you kind of drowned in it a little bit. I know, Josh, you've talked about kind of breaking things apart, honing things in so you're not trying to boil the ocean. What are some ways that people can think about, identifying which data that they should be using, right? What actually matters? What should your KPIs be so you're not just trying to look at every possible data source?
Well, first, Kate, I'm gonna now go through all my apps and make sure all of my locations are
Turn them
turned
all
on.
on. Nobody's got
I
time for
just,
that. Don't lie.
You
I
don't
just
want to
wonder
help the
if
real estate
there's,
industry, be successful.
I'm still reading the terms and conditions for all of them, so I'll be done.
will take a year.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea, it was probably 7 or 8 years ago. At Christmas, I went home, visit my mom, and I went into my room. I woke up one morning early and I sat at my desk around 9 a.m. and my intent was to draw out the real estate market. Take all of the different pieces of it, property types, construction, development, analysis, all of those things, and I just write a little bit, and I was going to understand the entire process and how it works. And around 11 a.m., I got up, I went into the kitchen and I poured a glass of scotch because I realized how difficult it was going to be to do that. There was way more in that process than
I
I
was
ever
hoping you
thought.
would email that to me if you'd finished it.
I think it has some teardrops on it from
On a napkin.
going through that. But it is breaking things down. So Kate mentioned one of the projects we're working on where we're looking at neighborhoods, and we started asking. The great thing about using machine learning for me has been that I've learned way more about real estate by learning about machine learning than I ever did by doing real estate, because it forces you to ask questions. You have to create some kind of mathematical model that accurately represents the real world. And one of the things we have our students do is take data from a neighborhood. So say you have Yelp or you have the New York Department of Buildings data and has a bunch of physical information about that building. And I say, take a block, pull out a block, look at all the buildings there, and then go walk around that block and look at the data you have and then look at the buildings. How does that data relate to what you're actually seeing and feeling? For neighborhood analysis, if you walk through Midtown Manhattan at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, it's going to be packed, people everywhere. If you walk through, let's say, West Village in Manhattan at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, it's going to be pretty quiet. But if you walk through Midtown Manhattan at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, it's probably going to be pretty quiet. Not a lot of restaurants open. If you walk through West Village at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, it's going to be off the hook. Bars, restaurants, people everywhere. So how do we capture that? How do we capture what's the relationships between these things? And what we're using this data for is to track it over time and see how things are changing. We looked at some data that showed Williamsburg over a 10-year period increased around 270%. Their median price per square foot for residential properties increased about 270%. Other area, Long Island City, was 132%, Harlem 100%, but many other places were around 40, 50, 60%. Well, so why do you have certain neighborhoods that increased so much faster relative to other neighborhoods? You're under the same macroeconomic conditions, the same regional economic conditions. Why do you have certain neighborhoods that perform so differently during that time period, during a 10-year period? And then if you take a different 10-year period, you're going to have different neighborhoods that performed better relative to other neighborhoods, and it probably won't be the same neighborhoods. So we started asking the question, why is that? What leads to some neighborhoods doing better than others over a specific time period? And we started looking at building permits and transportation information and and business information. Are businesses opening? Are they closing? Are the hours changing? Is the number of ratings that they're getting per month on average changing over a period of time? So if you have 10 years where a company is getting, or a restaurant is getting an average of 10 ratings per month, and then all of a sudden you see over a 12 or 24-month period that the number of ratings that they're getting is increasing, consistently increasing, then that tells you something, but it doesn't tell you much unless you compare it to the other 20 or 30 restaurants that are also in that neighborhood. If they're also experiencing an increase in the number of ratings, well, that tells you something about that neighborhood. But what does it tell you? Just having that information and say it's going up doesn't tell you why that is. So then we have to ask, well, why is that? What would make the number of ratings go up in an entire neighborhood on a consistent basis roughly the same? Maybe it's younger people moving in that are more tech savvy. Maybe it's higher educated people that use their phones more. If that is the case, then what does that tell us? Or how do we find out who that is? Why are people using their phones more? Why are the ratings going up? And if we can do that, then we say, why are those people moving into that area? If we can understand the kinds of people that are moving into an area, then we ask the question, well, what do they want? What do they want? Better apartments? Do they want better businesses? Do they want coffee shops or yoga shops? And again, you start going down that rabbit hole of asking a ton of questions to be able to figure out what those answers are. You don't have to. You can stop at some point, but your level of understanding of what's going on is going to be lower than if you do go down that rabbit hole. The problem is it takes a long time to go down that rabbit hole and you have to ask a lot of questions, but getting data to understand how that is changing and how that compares to neighborhoods over time. If the typical hours for an area is between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., that tells us something about what's going on. If the typical hours are between 5 p.m. and 2 a.m., that tells us something else. And then we look at the number of ratings, and we look at the types of businesses. We look at comparisons between the dollar sign, which means what is the price level of that, and what is the number of ratings. All of those things blend together. There are relationships between the price and say if you go to McDonald's and it's a $1 sign and it has a 4-star rating, and then you go to another restaurant that has $3 signs but it's a 4-star rating. Are those restaurants equivalent? Do you think they're the same thing, McDonald's and a nicer restaurant? Expectations are different, but that doesn't mean quality is different. So does the quality of that restaurant, the dollar signs, and the relationship to the number of stars it has have some kind of quantifiable meaning to it? You can't tell that from one restaurant or even 5 or 10 restaurants. You have to have thousands of restaurants. So we collect that on thousands of restaurants. We look at hours, we look at ratings, we look at the relationships between ratings, we look at the relationships between different neighborhoods and how those things are changing. And over time, it gives us more and more insight. We use that insight to then go back and ask more questions that give us more insight in turn. It's a consistent iteration between what results you're getting, the questions you're asking, and your understanding of the concept.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, obviously, there's a lot of technology can point you towards correlation, right? But that causation piece, I think, is where you really have to sit down, look it out, because there can be so many influences on the causation of this, right? It could be something that maybe isn't in the data at all, right? It could just be a false correlation. So, obviously,
100% of people that don't study data science will die.
It's a great point.
We had an example of that. That's kind of fun. It reminds me a little bit. There's an old saw story about Ernest Hemingway, and I think it was A Farewell to Arms. He had a scene on Lake Geneva where the heroine's umbrella blew inside out. So all these literary scholars were like, "What was the meaning of that? And what sort of turmoil? And what did that reflect about nature?" And he said, "I just wanted to show that it was a windy day." So to sort of like contrast the causation piece and how like wrapped around the axle you can get. We had a client who was seeing that they had a building that they were absolutely certain was going to be wildly successful based on all of the data about the neighborhood and the consumers and the, everything else. And it wasn't, and they couldn't figure out why. And then when they really looked at a data set we have called pathing, they saw that it was situated across from a freeway off-ramp with a really difficult U-turn that made it tricky to sort of get into the parking lot. So, you know, to counter the fact that all this is so complex and there's so much to consider, sometimes your road just isn't great, but you still need some data to determine that.
Right. And if you never drive the road, you know, that's not
Absolutely.
something the
Wouldn't know.
computer's not going to figure out.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like my fantasy football team. You know, it should be good on paper, but just
Right.
can't make it happen. I have an interesting question here, kind of about like, you know, are there sets of good data sources that you can rely on to triangulate on a trusted real estate decision? And obviously, I'm not going to make you guys weigh in on what's good and what's bad data, but I think this idea of benchmarking maybe and going back, you know, like once you're so far down the rabbit hole, what are some ways to kind of back up and make sure that you're not you know, kind of tripping in the details or getting caught around the axle, which is a good analogy that I like. Josh, do you have any idea about that of maybe like how to back out of analysis to just make, you know, to kind of make sure your models are still in line with what you want?
It really depends on the problem. We've had some where we do a kind of analysis called feature importance, where let's say we have 25 pieces of information on a single family home, and we're trying to develop an automated valuation model for single family, for example. This is not what we're doing, but let's say we were. So it's an easy thing to explain. We've looked at it and we've said, can we use a lower number of features than 25? Can we use 10 and still be able to estimate the value of that home, or 15? And if so, what is the combination of those? And what we find pretty consistently with real estate applications is that the more you use, the more accuracy you get. With many applications, you might, if you have 25 features, you might get to 10, find a good combination of 10, and then your accuracy doesn't improve very much if you use the other 15 of those. With real estate, it continues to improve, which means that they're all relevant in some way. Some less than others, of course. The square footage is going to be less important than the quality of the fireplace you have, but the fireplace does add. If you have two houses and one has an okay fireplace and one has a really nice fireplace, there might be a $5,000 difference in the value of that home. But you have 10 or 15 other features that could have that, and you could get a pretty wide variance in the potential value of that home if you don't account for some of those more qualitative features, so some of those more finite features.
Yeah.
So it depends on that problem that you're trying to solve. And this is also the important part. Again, I can't stress, people try to gloss over some of the details in designing these things and understanding them, but that is absolutely key. You cannot just get AI or machine learning and push a button and have it give you an outcome by throwing some data at it. It simply does not work. You will fail. You will fail every single time. It doesn't work that way. These things are mathematics. It's not magic. If you don't understand the problem, you don't understand the relationships and the importance of the features that go into it, the inputs, all of the factors, you will not get a good model. It will not work. And you have to be able to understand those things. You have to understand not just the problem. We see a lot of technical people that try to build real estate tech, and they don't understand the real estate well enough to capture those nuances. But we also see a lot of real estate people that try to build real estate tech that don't understand the modeling concepts well enough, and they gloss over things like data engineering, for example. That's a hugely important part of it, but also which models to use under which scenarios and how to tweak those models. If you don't understand both sides, or at least have a conceptual understanding of how they fit together, you're not going to understand how to build these things effectively, and you won't have success with it.
Mm-hmm.
I saw your V-shaped diagram of real estate skills and technology skills, and you're right, like they do diverge. I think it's really hard to find individuals anyway with expertise in both.
Yeah.
Can I stretch the intent behind that last question? Just make one point that I think is important. Sure. If you're talking about quality of data, like, you know, what's good data? Just sort of another caveat, in the geospatial land that we're in, most of the data is terrible. It's absolute crap. It can be highly anomalous. There's a lot of fraud if you have, you know, small app developers. So we are absolutely scrupulous about running models to determine where there might be fraudulent data, where we're seeing redundant data points. Things like if a ping was seen in Paris and then an hour later it's in San Francisco, that's not true. A fun little anecdote is if you go into the geospatial world and like ask systems what the most visited location in the world is, do you guys know? and this is only on computers. It's
Eiffel
called
Tower.
Null Island. And it is a spot. There's actually now, I think the Coast Guard has put a buoy, but it's a spot in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean whose coordinates are 0 degrees latitude, 0 degrees longitude. And it's just so many data points either are missing the lat long, or they just, they fill it out erroneously. So pay attention not just to like at the macro level, what data sources you should incorporate, but how good is the data itself that you're using, especially to Josh's point, when you're starting to feed models, because then everything can just go.
Yeah, I mean, for
And
non-technical
things-
people, sorry, Josh, for non-technical people, I think, they incorrectly think that data is a bit of a commodity, right? Like, oh, it's all the same. But when you, I think, get into seeing how the sausage is made, there's certainly a lot that can differ by.
Yeah, I think we throw out between 75 and 90% of the data that we ingest.
That's incredible.
Most of the data for real estate is the traditional data sources were meant for human, I call it human consumption. It's meant for somebody to copy and paste into an Excel spreadsheet, run a little with some formulas, or into a Word document or a PDF. That data is not sufficient. It doesn't work for machine learning applications. It is not formatted the right way. It is not. There are many problems with it, but it doesn't work. And a lot of people have the misconception that you can take data that we're typically used to using in real estate, give it to a machine, do some AI, and you get some magical answer. And the other side, it doesn't work that way. The data has to be AI is extremely powerful. Machine learning is very powerful, but it's very, very finicky. You have to give it the right kind of information. Even things like time series, if we have some time series that we work on for economic data, is given quarterly. So it's reported quarterly. Other data is reported monthly. We can't give those two data series to any kind of model and have it make sense. We have to figure out, do we create 2 months inside each quarter? Do we get rid of some of the quarter? Like, what do we do? How do we deal with this? Do we get rid of 2 months of data that we actually have, but then we have a much smaller number of observations to use to find those patterns? Do we create fake data, and meaning we create individual months within the quarters? In that case, we have more data, but we also have fake data because we don't really know what happened. It's kind of fuzzy. It becomes very, very difficult. And when you're using 40 or 50 different time series, you have to do that with each one of them and make it blend. It is a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
Do you believe that there are scenarios where synthetic data will be viable, or is it just the world is too dynamic and the systems that generate synthetic data probably can't keep up?
I do think that there are some scenarios, but they're few and far between. And you have to understand, like, if I'm bucketing something and all I want to know is an age group demographic 18 to 26, I don't really care if they're 24 or 23. I'm okay with that. Some of the information, if I'm trying to, let's say, have some comparables and I have certain information, but I'm trying to figure out what the cap rate is and I don't have access to that, to cap rates for every sale that I'm using as a comparable, and I try to interpolate that, I have a little bit of fuzziness that can throw you off pretty drastically on the valuation. So you have to, but this goes back to understanding the problem. Do I understand real estate well enough to know what factors would impact a cap rate, and maybe to know that I don't have information on those factors? I have maybe 5 comps and they range between a 5 and a 7 cap rate for the same kind of building in roughly the same area. You shouldn't have that kind of spread. You shouldn't have a 2% spread in the cap rate for the same type of building, same quality in the same area. It should be much tighter than that. If you do, there's something going on with those buildings, and often I don't have that information. So 7 or 5 more appropriate for the kind of building I have, or 5.5 or 6.25. I don't know. It's not a big difference in the percentages, but it makes a huge difference in the value of that building. And if I don't have that story behind it, I don't have that information, it makes it much more difficult for me to be able to interpret the data that I do have, because I don't have the context that explains why that data is what it is.
Throws everything else into question now, because there's obviously something out there you don't see.
Yeah. Did a major tenant just expire? Were there physical improvements that needed to be made that the seller just said, rather than me doing it, I'll price it out and let you pay for them along the way? Those are all viable scenarios, but they also make a very big difference in what the future value of that property is going to be and how I can estimate the cash flow going forward over the whole period. I just don't have that information. So it makes it risky for me to make that assumption and then make a prediction on top of that assumption.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it here. This has been so fascinating. Thank you both so much for the conversation. Thanks everyone for watching and listening. If anybody has any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to connect you with either of our two expert panelists here. You can email me at franco@propmodo.com. That's FRANCO @propmodo.com. Just want to wish everybody a great holiday season, a happy new year, and I will see you guys in 2024. Josh, Kate, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
I learned
Franco.
a ton. Great discussion. Thanks, Franco.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Cheers.